This is the challenge, is we don't really want to understand how these things are not only rooted in our nation at a foundational level, but how the values are bipartisan. And we see this a lot even in how our nation has kind of dealt with our history of enslavement and the dehumanization of African American people, where we have this narrative, even today, that says, well, the South was white supremacist and allowed slavery, and the North was in favor of Black people and supported Black lives and were anti-slavery. And that was absolutely false, right? Both the North and the South were blatantly white supremacists. They disagreed on the institution of chattel slavery, as we see in Abraham Lincoln, right? We have two chapters in the book Unsettling Truths deconstructing the mythological legacy of Abraham Lincoln, where Lincoln, by his own words, if you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, was a blatant white supremacist. I have no intention of making voters or jurors of Negroes or allowing them to hold office or to intermarry. There's a physical difference, he said, between the white and Black race, which will ever forbid the two from living in terms of social and political equality. But as long as they must remain together, there has to be the distinction of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, said Abraham Lincoln to applause that the superior position belongs to the white race. He was a blatant white supremacist. He and Judge Douglas disagreed on enslavement, but they absolutely agreed on white supremacy. And so we have to get rid of this narrative that the South was progressive or was conservative and about devaluing Black lives, and the North was progressive and saw the value. No, they both believed in the lie of white supremacy. They disagreed on the institution of enslavement. And so because we don't address it at a foundational level, we actually, I mean, to this day, if you read the 13th Amendment, we haven't actually abolished slavery. And that's one of Abraham Lincoln's legacies. This is what he gave our country. He gave us a constitutional way to protect the institution of slavery by not abolishing it, but redefining it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. And so we see it, we can see it if we look in our history with African Americans and enslavement. We can see it, I would say, even more clearly in how the doctrine of discovery was used against Native peoples. Not only was it used as a way to justify discovering lands that were already inhabited, but it also was used to justify manifest destiny and the ethnic cleansing of Native peoples. But we see it most clearly in the way that we work with land titles. I have a TEDx talk, and I'm going to put the link to this in the chat. I have a TEDx talk that I gave about 2.5 years ago. It's called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in US history. And in this TEDx talk, I go into depth on 3 or 4 Supreme Court cases. The first one back in 1823, Johnson versus McIntosh. And the most recent, at least back recent in 2018, was a 2005 case, which all reference the doctrine of discovery as the legal precedent for land titles. Basically saying that because natives are savages, even though we were here first, we only have the right of occupancy to land. Whereas Europeans, who are white and fully human, they have the fee title to the land, the right of discovery to the land, so they are the true title holders. And the case in 2005, the most recent case referencing the doctrine of discovery in a land dispute between the Oneida Indian Nation and the city of Sherrill, New York, that case was written. I actually identify it. I demonstrate how it's one of the most white supremacist Supreme Court cases written in my lifetime. And it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And people say they're shocked, right? Because she's the progressive voice of dissent. She was the progressive voice of dissent on this very conservative-leaning Supreme Court. She was the voice fighting for the marginalized. How could she write such an opinion? Well, because when your land titles are based on the legal conclusion that natives are savages, what that does is it makes white supremacy a bipartisan value. And so we see this very, very clearly. And we even see it, right? There was a case just this last summer. It came out, McGirt versus the state of Oklahoma, where it brought into question treaties signed back in the 1800s, declaring that most of eastern Oklahoma was reservation land. And the state of Oklahoma was arguing that they've never treated it as a reservation land. They said essentially the courts disestablished it, and McGirt and the Creek Nation were fighting for having that land identified as reservation land. And in 2020, the Supreme Court rules in favor of McGirt and the Creek Nation, and saying, yes, the state of Oklahoma does not have the right to disestablish these reservation lands. Yes, the courts do not have the right to disestablish reservation lands. And so they ruled in favor of McGirt and the Creek Nation. But they stated very, very, very clearly that the legislature, Congress, has the absolute right not only to disestablish reservation lands, but to break treaties with Native nations, and there is no consequence for that. This was in 2020 that this ruling came out. That basically, in front of the US Congress, Native nations have no rights. And whenever, and the quote they used was, whenever Congress can muster the will, they have the right to break treaties with Native nations, and there is no consequence for that. So this is where we have to deal with it at this level. And this is where we're not very good at addressing how deeply embedded almost all of our lives are on this institutional understanding of white supremacy.
I agree. And it's just interesting. Tomorrow we'll be joined by Gail Christopher and Heather McGee. And Gail is someone whose foundations around looking at systemic racism and beginning with narrative change, why this type of truth telling is so important. Because as a historian, as a previous high school teacher, right, I'm just sitting here thinking about the ways in which you laid out and complicated Abraham Lincoln, right? Everything that we have in terms of our history and the way that history is framed, specifically from a nationalistic perspective, is oriented around, specifically around Lincoln, right? Outside of, I would argue historical figures, such as Jesus, right? Lincoln is like one of those scholars who's, hundreds of books written about Lincoln. And the majority of them really failed in many ways to deal with this complicated aspect of his life, his leadership, and the ways in which, to your point, he openly functioned and promoted white supremacy, as did white abolitionists, which is something I talk to my students about all the time, and how they kind of get confused about this. But this is where the paternalism piece comes into play. You can say that at the same time with one side of your mouth, if you will, you can say that I don't believe in slavery, but I don't believe that blacks or those of African descent are equal to me.
Yeah.
Right. So and I think in many ways that is kind of what we're up against, right? It's almost like a sleight of hand approach that has historically played out. And what I call post-slavery, what I call segregation, the reason why we had to have segregation, Jim Crow laws, and why lynching and racial terror emerged, there had to be something to replace this system, the structure, right? No longer could African Americans or those of African descent who were previously enslaved, they didn't waking up in the morning and knowing that they were not in chains and they can come and go as they please. The white establishment had to put something in place to maintain that system, that racial hierarchy. And so, but what's happened is we've been tricked, specifically around policy and what we perceive to be legal wins. But there's nothing structural that's really being done. I think that's to your larger point, but I think it's also important that we understand why truth telling at a very basic and foundational level is so essential. And originally when I started the Mitchell program, one of the things that we put in our mission and our goals was that we're going to complicate historical narratives. And we got feedback from someone and they asked, why would you want to do such a thing? Right. And for me, it's like, so for me, I mean, we definitely agree on this point, but it's like, this is why we're in the shape that we're in, is because that we've not allowed marginalized voices to be centered and to be even represented in larger national narratives of our nation. And we have this hero worship type of structure as it relates to truth telling and education, because I see a lot of this is being connected to history education. It informs how future policymakers who are in the classrooms right now, right, the decisions that they make, right? And so I think all of this is largely connected. But I'm going to turn it back over to you, Mark, and then from there we can open it up to some questions.
Yeah, let's talk for a moment about Lincoln, because he absolutely is a very crucial piece of understanding how deeply embedded white supremacy is within our nation. And I would agree. If, in fact, if you go back and look at how the heresy of Christian empire and Christendom was birthed, we argue in the first in chapters 3 and 4 of our book that it was Eusebius who was propping up Constantine, who wrote Christ out of ecclesiastical history in order to insert Constantine as the savior for Rome. And so Constantine became the Messiah figure for early Christendom or Christian empire, because Jesus was opposed to Christian empire. So in our context, Lincoln is our Messiah figure. And I tell people, even though he was assassinated on Good Friday, his blood doesn't do squat for you. There's a quote hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally says, when it was Abraham Lincoln responding to an op-ed, a call by the New York Tribune for him to immediately emancipate the slaves. And he responded by saying, "My primary object in this struggle is not to save or destroy slavery, is to preserve the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." There's a quote hanging at the Lincoln Memorial that literally states, according to Lincoln, Black lives don't matter. Now, not only is his white supremacy evident there, but in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act and it's a settlement act, the Land Settlement Act. And the Settlement Act, the Land Settlement Act provides 160 acres to anyone who goes west and homesteads. Is the Homestead Act, and they homestead for 5 years and they get 160 acres of land. The Pacific Railway Act provides the land and the resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. Within 2.5 years of signing that bill, after the hanging of the Dakota 38, the nullifying of the treaties with the tribes in Minnesota and their forced removal from the state, after the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado and the removal of the Cheyenne and Arapaho from the state of Colorado, and after the Long Walk and the forced removal of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache from the territory of New Mexico, Abraham Lincoln has literally ethnically cleansed the states of Minnesota, Colorado, and New Mexico to make way for 3 of the earliest and primary routes of the Transcontinental Railway. Literally, he is one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. And I can only imagine how many Native lives were saved because he was assassinated in 1865. He was actively holding Navajo people, my people, at Bosque Redondo in what can only be described as a death camp when he was assassinated. We weren't released until after he died. There are 5 states, northern states, where he did not emancipate the slaves. And those enslaved in those 5 northern states did not receive their freedom until after Lincoln died. Abraham Lincoln was a blatant white supremacist who was looking for a way to constitutionally protect the institution of slavery, and was actively ethnically cleansing this nation. We start there again. There's 2 chapters in our book on Abraham Lincoln, because you have to deconstruct him thoroughly, and we introduce those chapters by observing that history is written by the victors, and because of that, the United States of America faces grave challenges because we've never lost a war that matters, which means for 250 years we've been able to write our own history. So if we would imagine if Nazi Germany won World War II, we can only imagine how they would record the life and the legacy of Adolf Hitler. Had they won World War II, we can only imagine how they would have recorded the horrors of the Holocaust, right? We have Holocaust deniers today. If they had won the war, imagine what Holocaust. There was no Holocaust. This is exactly what we did with Lincoln. Not because he was more righteous or more holy than Adolf Hitler, because we won those wars. And so our nation got to frame that history of this very genocidal man as a hero instead of a villain. And so, yeah, the fact that the US has written its own history for 250 years has meant most Americans don't even understand the beginnings of how horrific our history was. We understand the mythological. I say this in my lectures, that we teach a mythology, we don't teach a history of our country. And it's books like mine, it's stuff like you're talking about, that we need to state the truth of our history. There's a great quote I love to use from a native elder. His name is George Erasmus. He's from the Dene people up in Canada. And he said, when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there, he said, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build a community, he said, you have to start by creating common memory. I love that quote. I think it gets to the heart of our nation's problem, especially with race, which is we have a white majority that remembers a mythological history of discovery and expansion, opportunity and exceptionalism. Meanwhile, we have marginalized and other communities of colors that have the lived history of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, Jim Crow laws, boarding schools, Indian massacres, internment camps, mass incarceration, segregation, families being ripped apart at our borders, and we have no common memory. And there's actually no point in US history, there's no point where we can look back as a nation, especially as communities of color, and say, oh, remember how good things used to be back then. So when we have candidates running to make America great again, our candidates saying America's great already, our president to announce that they want to restore the soul of America, we have to say, what are you trying to do? Do you not understand how horrific the history of this nation was for people of color? To go back and restore that, to make that go back to that kind of greatness, to go back to that kind of legacy, it's absolutely horrifying. It's only white people who will say that they want to go back and restore what our nation used to be, because as they become a smaller and smaller majority, they are becoming more and more afraid of their centered position being in jeopardy.
Yep.
So they will look back with a sort of nostalgia about the past, whereas everybody else is like, even though we're moving incredibly slowly, we're actually moving to a better place. The past is not something any of us want to return to.
Yeah, I agree. Wow, this is good. I think for me, Mark, one of the things I want to kind of center on, and this is among many things, I'm working with Dr. Christopher and others around supporting the establishment of a truth commission, right? Truth, racial healing, and transformation. And there's a reason why reconciliation is not there. And I think your quote speaks to that. And it's so difficult when we look at wanting to heal and have conversations about healing, but dealing with, to your point, the fact that what are we going back to, right? This whole conciliation and there was no community,
yeah,
from the beginning, right? And with that, what are we then going back to? Because when you think, to your point, a lot of marginalized communities will argue that they're catching hell now. But when you say things like, let's go back to, right, our foundation,
yeah,
that is just not something that is, yeah. And so I think, to your point, this is like where we're at in this nation, and we have an opportunity here to really have a conversation about truth and healing as well as transformation. But I think what I always believe, and it's something that I think that it's so important, is justice has to be centered. We can have a conversation about healing and about truth and about transformation, but if justice is not on the table and healing and truth is not on the table, then there's really nothing to talk about. And I think that is where we're at in this country. And I think that is what this interracial coalition and movement has exposed to the political powers at be during the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor uprising prior to the election. But go ahead, I'll let you respond. I did see a question.
Yeah, language is so important in this, right? One of the things I've been calling for years now, well, 5 or 6 years, and one of the things it was a center plank of my platform. I advocated for in the book. I advocate for this in my TEDx talk. The United States of America, I'm convinced, needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. It's a conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. However, I would not call ours Truth and Reconciliation, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, which isn't true. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, because conciliation is the mediation of a dispute. One of the things that I firmly believe is that American exceptionalism, the myth of American exceptionalism, which is rooted in the lie of white supremacy, is a coping mechanism for our nation that doesn't know how to deal with its genocidal history and its current racist reality. In other words, white America has to tell itself it's exceptional. It has to tell itself it's better than everybody else. It has to say we have a special relationship with the God of Abraham. We have a land covenant. Because if we don't have those things, if we're not that, then we are merely just another genocidal, ethnic cleansing, colonial nation that hasn't actually been held accountable for anything. And no one knows what to do with that. And so they cling to this myth of American exceptionalism, not realizing that that is literally their coping mechanism for how they deal with, how they stay in an intentional state of denial regarding our nation's horrific history. And we see politicians doing this almost better than anyone else. And not only white politicians, we also see it in candidates of color, right? We saw President Obama, who entered into politics in 2008, where he was running on a vision of hope. And he actually was rebuked by politicians for not, he was seen as being going on an apology tour early in his presidency. And they worked very hard. And I did state this during my campaign, that one of Joe Biden's roles as his vice president was to train President Obama how to speak the language of American exceptionalism. And by the time he left office in 2016, President Obama was absolutely speaking the language of exceptionalism, telling the DNC in 2016, America's great already. Cory Booker, who had presidential aspirations in 2016, he was endorsing Hillary Clinton at the DNC in 2016. In his speech, he acknowledged that our Declaration of Independence calls natives savages. He acknowledged that the Constitution excludes women. He acknowledged the Three-Fifths Compromise. All of those were very courageous, because most politicians at that level don't acknowledge any of those faults with our foundations. But he ended that section of his speech by telling the DNC that these things do not detract from our nation's greatness. Now, he would never say that to a room full of people of color. He would never say that to an all-Black audience. He would never say that to an all-Native audience. He would never say that to an audience filled with women. The reason he said it is because if you want to be the candidate of the Democratic or the Republican Party, you have to get white landowning men to vote for you. The first two primaries, caucus and primary, are held in Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa is the 5th whitest state in the country. New Hampshire is the 3rd. Iowa has the highest rate of private lands. New Hampshire has the highest rate of home ownership. Iowa has a state law saying they must be the first caucus state. New Hampshire has a state law saying they must be the first primary state. If you want to be president in our democratic system as a Republican or a Democrat, you have to spend a year campaigning to white land owning men from the states of Iowa and New Hampshire. And you have to learn how to appeal to their need to understand their own exceptionalism. And so this is the challenge that we see with even the way our campaigns and our presidential politics work, is it's all about teaching even people from the margins how to speak the language affirming the myth of American exceptionalism. And if you don't learn how to speak it, then you never get nominated, right? Even the Democratic Party, they had the most diverse pool of candidates they've ever had as a party in 2019. They had more people of color, more women, more members of LGBTQIA2S+. Even Joe Biden's wife acknowledged in 2019 that he was not the best candidate. He did not have the best platform of the other candidates. But throughout that campaign, as they got closer and closer to the primary in New Hampshire and the caucus in Iowa, they slowly removed those candidates of color and marginalized candidates from the debate stage. Meanwhile, they changed the rules to make room for Tom Steyer, who was a white landowning male from the 1%. And then once they finally whittled it down to what? Joe Biden, the most status quo, least inspiring white landowning male they had in that entire group of people a year and a half earlier. And they whittled it down to him. Now, most people will say, right, they will say, well, right now there's all this hubbub about the Republicans and state legislators around the country are blocking people from voting. That's true, they are. But see, what we have to understand the challenges between these two parties. The Republican Party knows they are not growing. They know that they are more explicitly racist and sexist and white supremacists, and their base isn't growing, but they have a very strong base. And so they know that the more people who vote, the less chance they have of winning. The last Republicans that won, the last two that won, actually lost the popular vote. George Bush and Donald Trump lost the popular vote. The only way they won was because of the white supremacy put into the Electoral College. So Republicans are terrified of voters, and they work hard to make it hard to vote. The Democrats that have a more diverse base, they have more people of color in their base, but yet they whittle it down every single time to a white person, except for in 2008 and 2012. But they whittle it down to a white landowning male most of the time, and they did it very explicitly in 2016. So when they get into the general election, what the Democrats are afraid of is that their base is going to wander and begin looking for candidates who look more like them and represent their communities better. And so the Democrats are the ones who are filing lawsuits to keep third-party and independent candidates off of the ballots. Both parties are absolutely trying to destroy democracy. The Republicans are terrified of voters, and the Democrats are afraid of competition. We tend to only point at the Republicans most of the time, but this is the problem we have, is both parties are about trying to keep the white landowning male centered in our national politics. That's what the two-party system is all about, and it does it very, very, very effectively. And it works hard to train marginalized candidates from the margins, to speak that language of exceptionalism, so that in the long run it can keep white landowning men centered as long as humanly possible.
Thank you so much, Mark. I see that here in the chat. Let me see, everyone. I made it public so everybody can chat publicly. But also, I wanted to bring on Kathy Saunders, who had a question. And I'm going to ask Kathy to come on and ask your question, and I can unmute you. There you are. You're unmuted. So go ahead, Kathy. Please.
Yeah, I think I unmuted myself. Okay, yeah. So slightly long question, but and I'll try to break it down. I was interested if you've sort of noted the use of abolitionist sort of rhetoric identification by present day movements. And I'm thinking especially among Christians, but everything from anti-trafficking efforts to some rather questionable versions of John Newton's biography and the History of Amazing Grace that sort of gloss over that he converted a long time before he became an abolitionist. Or, and I think I'm more comfortable with these, I've been seeing people talk who are sort of doing anti-carceral state efforts, everything from police reform or abolition to prison reform or abolition, sort of in that general area. Some of those movements are now being described as abolitionists. I was wondering whether you sort of noted that trend, have any thoughts on that trend, especially given the sort of mixed history of abolition, and obviously the fact that you can be abolitionist, could be historically abolitionist and white supremacist very easily at once.
Yeah, I'll give you a bit longer answer to that. So to understand, and this is from my perspective, to understand our nation's dialogue on race, our historical dialogue on race, you really have to understand how the two primary oppressed races in our nation were begun: the Black race and the American Indian race. The Black race was developed in part, and race is not, it's not a genetic difference, right? It's a human construct. Race is a human construct, and the Black race was constructed in part through what's called the one drop rule. So the one drop rule states if you have a single drop of African blood, you're black. Now, why do we have this rule? Well, because black were the labor force. Black people were the labor force. So our nation wanted as many of them as possible. And so they used the one drop rule so that they could multiply that race. The American Indian race was developed through what's called the blood quantum rule. The blood quantum rule states that you're depending on who you marry, you're full, then you're half, you're a quarter, you're eighth, you're 16. Eventually you're bred out of existence. Now, why do we have this rule? Well, because the mythology of this nation is that this land was empty. They discovered empty lands. The US owes treaty obligations to Native nations. They want as few of us as possible. So the American Indian race was constructed to diminish our numbers. And then even those that survived the genocide against us, we were moved to reservations in the very margins of the corners of our nation. Our country did not want anyone to have to wrestle with the psychological and emotional trauma of understanding who was ethnically cleansed from their land so that their house could be built. And so because of the way these two races were constructed, it created two different realities, which is it multiplied the African American race. And so some of those issues have been much more visible, and it diminished and marginalized the challenges for American Indian race. And so because it's put the African American challenges more front and center, the oppression of African people more front and center, I would say our nation has been working for 250 years to try and sanitize that conversation, make it as safe as possible for white people. That's what it's been trying to do. And so again, this is why it has the narrative, right? That the North was good because they were opposed to slavery and the South was bad because they allowed slavery, not acknowledging that both sides were blatantly white supremacists, right? They don't want to deal with that. And so even if you look at our civil rights movement, right, it didn't get us to where we wanted to be. And even though it brought more civil rights for marginalized people to the forefront, our nation has been working very hard to both sanitize the teachings of Dr. King, make him much more safe than he actually was, and to even walk back what we've done. Like my daughter's been studying about the whole process of equal, separate but equal, and the integration of schools. And even though we have separate but equal is no longer the rule, and they have integrated school, but our schools are more segregated than they were even 50, 60 years ago. And so again, our nation has been working to walk this back. And so because we don't deal with the underlying challenges, so even if we look at during the 2020 election, there was a growing debate, and there is a growing debate around the country. There's a lot of discussions about we want to deal with truth and reconciliation, or we want to deal with some kind of our history of enslavement. And there was a more robust debate about even paying reparations in the 2020 presidential campaign primary. Now, I completely agree that there was injustice enacted against African American people, and the just response to that is to compensate and to pay reparations to that community. I do not deny that for a moment. However, if you've ever been a part of a class action lawsuit, and class action lawsuits are known for being fraught with over-the-top liability, incredible risk for the corporation. And so those trials almost never go to court, right? They almost never go to trial. They often get settled beforehand. And if you're a part of a class action lawsuit and there's a settlement, and you get notified that, hey, you have some piece of the settlement and so you have to go pick it up, whatever it may be, some money or some whatever else. Now, before you get that settlement, you almost always have to sign a waiver, right? That says you're now putting this to rest and you are giving up your right to litigate this issue again. You are you're laying this down now. So I've been telling, and I said this during my campaign, if we allow white America to pay the fine for its sin of enslavement, or its injustice of enslavement, not sin, it's injustice of enslavement. Sin brings it a much more complicated. I'll talk about that in a moment. But anyway, I'll call it the injustice of enslavement. if we allow white America to pay for that injustice before it actually abolishes slavery, I can almost guarantee you slavery will never get abolished. It won't happen. And one of the challenges we face today is that slavery is still legal. It's been constitutionally protected within our criminal justice system. The other challenge I have with reparations is reparations are only just if you diminish the injustice against Native peoples merely down to the theft of labor. If you don't include all the other dehumanizing things that happen to African people, if you only reduce it down to the theft of labor, you can begin to calculate some amount that you might be able to somehow compensate for. But it diminishes the injustice merely to the theft of labor and doesn't deal with or deal justly with all of the other injustices that took place as a part of that institution of enslavement. And so it's only a piece. I would say it's a necessary piece, but the timing is crucial. And the understanding of this is only a piece of the entire workings of what needs to be done to bring justice into this piece of our nation's history. And so, you know, there is the challenge is we have a lot of people who believe that if they can just say I was against slavery, that they are somehow now walking away from, or they are now being able to say, I'm no longer believing in white supremacy. That's actually not true at all, where we see that very clearly in Abraham Lincoln, who was a blatant white supremacist and opposed to enslavement. And so this is where I'm always trying to bring the conversation deeper. And I just want to go back really quick and say one more time why I didn't use the word sin for slavery, because I was challenged by this, and I'm a Christian, and I would agree that slavery is against the commands of God, and it's against the will that God has for people and how we treat one another. But when we talk about it as a sin at a national level, so Joe Biden, for example, during his campaign referred to slavery as America's original sin. When you refer to this injustice and you define it theologically for a group of people who do not all adhere to the same theology, let alone the same religion, if you define it that way instead of as an injustice, which is about a common understanding of what's right and wrong, you are actually imposing your theological views upon people who do not necessarily hold to those views. Mm-hmm. So this is why I try to refrain from publicly referring to slavery as a sin, not because I don't believe it's a sin, but because I want our nation to deal with this injustice. And if I try to impose my theological view on other people, then I'm merely going to be doing what was done to my own people by this nation when they began to impose their theology upon Native peoples and use that to justify not only boarding schools, but even our genocide. So I try to be very careful with my language.
Yeah, I did want to your point, Kathy, as a historian, this is something that I really have wrestled with, and I begin to look at in terms of what this paternalism looks like in the modern sense as it relates to the modern day abolitionism, right? So my orientation towards the white abolitionist paternalistic mindset, specifically as it relates to promoting the end of slavery, but maintaining the system and believing in the system that slavery is rooted in. We see this, I think our best modern day example is evidenced within the ways in which corporations respond to injustices, right? So what I mean by that is post George Floyd, when the uprisings were going on, I remember when I went down to DC for the 50th anniversary, a part of some of our students and some scholars of the Mitchell program, we participated in the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington this past year. And when we were there, I mean, we had never seen so many different corporations. I know that Uber had several vehicles, as did other organizations that are Black Lives Matter. They're blacking out social media, all of this stuff. And when you begin to look at, these corporations, and when we look at, out of one side of their mouth, Black Lives Matter, but when you look at the makeup of the administration, of the executive leaderships, right, of these organizations and all of these banks, for example, who in many ways, I mean, have no have direct ties to the enslavement of African Americans in this country, which is clearly documented. Now here they come to say Black Lives Matter, right? This is the same type of behavior I think we can see that is tracked within as we look at the evolution of white abolitionism and the ways in which paternalism and systemic racism are still able to thrive within in spite of the outward marketing and narrative theft, which is what I call narrative theft that's taking place. The goal is to control the narrative and exploit the narrative. In any way you would exploit any other narrative. And like I said, my orientation to this really comes from my wife is actually an African American literature scholar who focuses on slave narratives. And I began to work through this with her as she was finishing up her master's thesis around the pruning that took place in slave narratives, right? And so the whole idea that white abolitionists would come in and say, for instance, you had Frederick Douglass or others, for an example, and they would have their narrative, they would tell their truth, and then you would have to partner with, to get your work published, a white abolitionist organization who would then prune the narrative. Right? And I asked my wife when she introduced me to this term, I said, what does this mean? And what does this pruning mean? And she pretty much she said it meant, that there's an editing, there's a cleaning up. Pretty much it's the belief that you're not able to tell your story effectively enough. We have to do it for you. We believe that you shouldn't be enslaved, but you are still inferior. And because of that, we have to show you how to tell your story. Right. But go ahead, Mark. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, let me expand on that just a little bit. So one of the ways we see this really clearly, and I like what you're saying there, is when we look at the history of boarding schools in the US. So in 1890, we had one of the most horrific massacres of Native peoples, the massacre at Wounded Knee. 350 Dakota men, women, and children slaughtered in a single day. The US Army, the US Congress awards 20 Congressional Medals of Honor for that massacre. 2 years later, our nation is slowly losing its stomach for outright genocide of Native peoples, but they still want our land. So Richard Pratt, who was really he popularized the issue, the institution of Indian boarding schools, taking Native children from their homes, putting them in military-style boarding schools, punishing them for speaking their languages or practicing their culture. Forced assimilation was what it was. He was giving a speech at a conference in 1892, kind of justifying his thinking about boarding schools. And in his speech, he stated the goal here was to kill the Indian to save the man. And to justify it, he immediately went back to our nation's history with enslavement. And he said, as abhorrent as slavery was, it bestowed upon Black people the greatest blessing they've ever received, which is it brought them from savagery in Africa, savagery and cannibalism in Africa, to becoming civilized and English speaking here in America. And how did that happen and so quickly? By association, he said, by allowing them to associate with members of the higher race, i.e. their slave owners, they became English speaking and civilized. So this helps us understand why assimilation is one of the core values of America, the United States. To the white supremacist mind, one of the most benevolent things they can do to this globe filled with subhumans is to allow them to associate with them and even begin to act like, speak like, behave like, and worship like them. And so this is how this whole understanding of paternalism and the way it's enacted upon communities of color, that belief, that practice is actually rooted in white supremacy. One of the reasons I don't use the phrase white privilege is because white privilege makes it sound like what white people have is a blessing they just need to learn how to share. That's not true. White people have things other people don't, not because they've been blessed, because that's what happens when you ethnically cleanse a continent and import other people to build it up. You become wealthy beyond measure. That's what happens when you have oppressive behaviors and actions and you're not held accountable. The goal is not just to get people, white people, to share what they've stolen. It's actually, white privilege is a racial injustice that we need to learn how to confront. And so language is very important, but understanding how this is the thinking, and even how these things were put into practice, was rooted in this lie of white supremacy, which was now trying to act benevolently by allowing people, subhumans, to assimilate to their languages, to their cultures, to their way of living. And that was seen as somehow a gift that they were doing.
Wow. Let's go ahead and transition to another question. I know that some of you all have been waiting for a minute, but I think it's one of my students who is here. If Sarah Atif would like to speak, I see your question and comment here. Sarah, are you there? Sarah's still here. Well,
Yes, yes,
yeah.
yes. Thank you very much for this talk. For
No
me as a student, it was a great learning experience. I'm learning so much, and I heard all the talk very carefully. A few comments that I would like to make is that, the way you talked about Abraham Lincoln was very interesting, and we as students did go through learning about how great he was and what great things he did for us, for the world as such. And the second thing which I would like to talk about is, you mentioned land labor acknowledgement, and I feel that it should be a part of at least every academic environment, so we all understand the land we are here, what's the history of that land. And the question I have was, Mark Charles, you talked about the way we are trying to write our history. So now America is living in a different world where we are impacting the world in general, not just our country.
Yeah.
So do you think we are also we would also try to write our history there, our international wars, maybe 100 years down the road, when people look back, they would look at something differently than what we see today?
Oh,
Thank you.
absolutely. The United States of America is one of the most colonial nations in the history of the world. And not only has our white supremacy, racism, and sexism had huge impacts domestically, it has untold impact globally. And we haven't even begun to deal with what we've enacted and what we've imposed upon the rest of the world. When I was running for president, I was, we all saw, or most people saw, that Deb Haaland was nominated as Secretary of the Interior and was just confirmed about a week ago. And that was a great, I'm very happy for her. I support her nomination and her role as the Secretary of the Interior. She was actually on my shortlist, at the top of my shortlist, to become Secretary of State. One of the things I feel very strongly about is that, just like we need to create a common memory here in the US, we have to create a common memory globally. If we look at our closest allies, our NATO allies, one of the most common traits we have with all of our native allies is we are all colonial nations, right? People were shocked a few weeks ago when Prince Harry and his wife Meghan identified that there was racism present in the royal family. And you saw Oprah Winfrey drop her jaw, right? It's like, well, this is not surprising. Of course they're racist. Do you not understand what what the United Kingdom is about, what Great Britain is about? Don't you understand how they were built? I mean, this is just because we've gotten more into a more modern age. They've never dealt with their history. And so I felt very strongly that not only would it be very, very beneficial for us to have a native president, which is why I was running, but I would love to have had our primary ambassador, our diplomatic face to the globe, also be someone who is indigenous to these lands, so that we could begin to have these same types of discussion, creating common memory, dealing with our history of colonialism, not only with our opponents, but even more so with our allies. So yeah, I think we haven't even begun to talk about, I mean, we see the damage our racism, sexism, white supremacy has done domestically. We haven't even begun to survey the damage that has been wrought on the nations around the globe. because of our actions and the actions of our allies.
And being in a school, conflict analysis and resolution, that's, and with this field of peace and conflict studies being so oriented towards the international space, I think you bring a great point here, Mark, around the damage that's done internationally. When you fail to deal with your own nation's issues appropriately, as it relates to failing to acknowledge systemic racism. And yeah, I just think that's so important when we talk about this international piece and what we represent going forward. When we carry this banner of democracy globally, what comes with that?
Yeah.
There's to deal with. But go ahead.
There's a great book. It's coming out in in about a year, I think. It's by a native author named Sarah Augustine. And it's about the doctrine of discovery and her experience with wrestling with it more internationally. My book is more about it here domestically in US history. She's talking about how she's seen it internationally. And it's a really good book because it shows how even a lot of what's called development by Western nations is literally about somehow trying to take lands from indigenous peoples around the globe. And the way that we've worked together in cohort with our NATO allies and other Western nations to literally steal lands to this day from indigenous peoples around the world. And, if we had Joe Biden had a major hiccup last week in his negotiations with his Secretary of State with China, where they met in Anchorage last week. And they both accused each other of breaking protocol, and China basically called out America. And they said, why do you act like you're so superior? You have all this racial violence, you have all this police violence, you have your democracies in a shambles. Why are you acting like you're the God's gift to the globe? And if you listen, and the way it was reported, even by our mainstream media, oh, how dare China talk to us this way? This was so on this, they broke protocol of international negotiations and blah, blah. How could they, right? But if you listen to what China was saying, they weren't wrong. They weren't wrong. The difference is China now has both the financial and the military clout that it doesn't feel the need to massage our ego. And so they actually are looking at us eye to eye and saying, you are not that great, United States of America. And they're right. They're not incorrect. We're just not used to people talking to us like we're not somehow superior or exceptional. Now, I can guarantee you they talk about us that way behind our backs, but we are not used to having them talk to us about that way on the international stage to our faces. And China is beginning to do that. And it's because they no longer feel the need to massage our ego and affirm our mythological exceptionalism. They don't need those things they don't need things from us anymore. And so it was really interesting to see not only how the Biden administration responded to that calling out, but even how the public and the mainstream media responded to it, which is they reported like it was something negative instead of acknowledging they're not wrong. Everything they were saying about us was actually pretty accurate. We are in a mess, right? We did just have our president lifting up a whole fallacy and claiming fraud where fraud didn't exist. We literally allowed white nationalist terrorism to take over our capital. We have a huge mess here, and yet we don't like it when other nations point that out. We would much prefer that they just point to our exceptionalism and wait for us to bestow our benevolence upon them.
Yeah, and I would argue that is always something I talk to my students about as well when we talk about the ways in which failing to deal with the issues of systemic racism and injustice within this country, how it is a national security issue. Right?
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother debate we can get into. First of all, you can look at not only the way that China boldly did this openly, right? And that doesn't negate the human rights struggle issues that they're always have been struggling with. That's going on there. But I think it's to your point, you saw this with, well, this was what the whole Facebook, social media, Russian focus on Black Lives Matter, using these groups, right? Pitting this division, using the realities that really can be dated back to the Cold War era, right? When we talk about Cold War civil rights, you're talking about what Russia is running in terms of articles around the freedom riders and all these things that are going on during the Soviet Union is exploiting, calling out the contradictions around American democracy as it relates to how people of color who come home in uniform in some cases are treated disgustingly, right? And who are ignored, right? These are the things that are oftentimes done. Unfortunately, it shouldn't take this shaming on the national stage for America to really deal with the realities in which it's failed to acknowledge it around systemic racism. I want to go ahead and transition. I'm trying to be a good moderator here. But I'm going to go to my colleague Scheherazade. I'm Dr. Scheherazade Jafari, who had a question a while back, and then from there we'll go to I believe it is a Pamela McNeil. And so, Dr. Jafari, are you there?
I'm here. Yes.
Great. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this really important and fascinating conversations. My question is, I'll see.
You're breaking up a little bit.
I can articulate it. It's stemming in part from, I'm teaching a course. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, now we can, yes.
Okay. So it's a question that my students and I have struggled a bit with in the class that I'm teaching right now on decolonizing peace and conflict resolution. And it also stems for me from Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's popular article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And we talk about how their trouble.
Okay. So, Dr. Jafari, let me just, you're breaking up.
For one group.
We can't hear you well, so I'm going to go ahead and read the question
justices
now.
for question. I mean, sorry. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so Dr. Jafari did put a question and she typed it out. So I'm going to briefly try to ask this. One second. One of the things that, this is from Dr. Jafari here, one of the things that I struggle with is how to pursue justice for a community that is not in any way at the expense of the other. For example, in the article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, Tuck and Yang talk about Black and brown settlers seeking justice and equity for Black and brown people. That includes, for instance, the redistribution of power and resources and land, but which is ultimately at the expense of indigenous people. Another form of colonialism, albeit in a different form. I'd love to hear both of you, your thoughts on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one that I've tried to address numerous times as I've written and spoken over the past decade. I think one of the things that's allowed that to continue is because of the way we generally treat issues of race in silos. And so we'll deal with only one issue here and one issue here. And this is why one of the things I'm trying to do is call for a more national dialogue on race, gender, and class so that we can actually deal with the foundational level issues. We also need to recognize that whiteness is working very hard to keep itself centered and to bring allies into its own cause. And so, for example, if we go back to the end of enslavement, right, and one of the promises that were made to the formerly enslaved African American people was that they would be given 40 acres and a mule. Now, that promise was never kept, but what it held out for African Americans is now they could become landowners. The problem is the land that the US was offering was all stolen land. And so they were now trying to align the African American community against the Native community, because the only way that the American lifestyle, the only way our nation is sustainable is if we continue the oppression, right? So one of the things I think we have to recognize is that what we have right now, and this is why I refuse to call it white privilege, it's not something that needs to be shared. What we have is not sustainable. The United States of America is 5% of the world's population, and we consume 25 to 30% of the world's renewable resources. If everybody in the world consumed the way the average American does, the amount of renewable resources would be depleted by the month of April. So we have to acknowledge that it's not about we just need to let everyone share what we have. No, what we have is not sustainable, and it's actually dependent upon the oppression of other people. And so we have to actually teach ourselves, train as a nation, how to live differently. We need to actually change our consumption. We need to behave differently. It's not, and this is why one of the challenges we face, right? Even when we talk about well, we'll just go with the America First policy, right? So Donald Trump was called out for his blatant America First policy. Now, Biden has not been nearly as vocal about America First. But if you go back and calculate the number of vaccine doses purchased by the United States of America and the number of people that we are working to vaccinate within our nation without trying to get vulnerable populations vaccinated around the globe. The WHO just called out the US and other Western nations for the way that we are literally hoarding vaccines and keeping poorer nations from being able to be vaccinated because of our nation first policies. Now, so this is a challenge, right? This is something we're facing where, yes, Trump was called out for saying America first, and the WHO is basically saying you're still acting this way. This is not a US pandemic, this is a global pandemic. And simply by acting as America first, we're not going to solve that problem. And this is one of the things that as a nation, we have to recenter ourselves. We have to decenter ourselves in diplomatic and foreign policy and global situations, and understand that what we do just by virtue of the way we do things is not sustainable and does not lead to a healthy community globally. And so I would say that, yeah, one of the challenges we face is that we have a life, we have a nation here that is built on the oppression of other people. And until we address that, how that's been embedded into our foundations, all we're going to do is continue to perpetuate that oppression against the people at the bottom. You know, another simple way you can point this out, there was a lot of debate in the 2020 campaign about having a wealth tax. And I absolutely agree that the 1% needs to be taxed and pay their taxes fairly and equally as other people. But there was also a lot of ways where candidates were saying they could fund their social programs by adding additional taxes to billionaires. Now, the challenge with doing that is that creates an environment where our programs are dependent on our economy continuing to produce billionaires. So in the short run, it might work. In the long run, it's going to just continue this injustice of inequality that we already have. We need an economy that doesn't produce billionaires. That's what we need. Now, no one wants to talk about that. But so the challenge we have is we're so used to having this nation that is literally dependent upon the oppression of others that we just want to be in the right group. but that's not sustainable. So this is where we have to work to actually rethink what is it that we feel entitled to, and how do we need to change our expectations.
Well, with that, Mark, we're right around the 5 minute or 4 minutes at this point. I want to go ahead and close us down and say thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I want you to come back, right? So we got to continue because there's so much more to talk about. If you can go ahead again, for everyone who came in late, put the link to your book in the chat, that would be helpful. But I also want to thank the Carter School for this opportunity. As the Mitchell Program Director and Assistant Professor at the Carter School, we're thankful for this Peace Week that's committed to and taking on the difficult task as an institution dealing with and confronting racism and dealing with it as an institution and embracing that. I'm really proud to be a part of this group and this week that we're hosting here at the Carter School. And I think this event, as well as all of the events, speak to the important work that needs to be done continuously. There needs to be more conversations like this, but there also needs to be more action, right? And I think we've got to find a way to talk and work at the same time, right?
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. This was an honor to be a part of this discussion with you and your colleagues this week. I want to thank everyone who asked questions, and thank you for your thoughtful questions about this. I did put a link to the book where you can purchase signed copies of Unsettling Truths from my website at wirelesshogan.com. I also just want to encourage people, I'm very active on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and even TikTok. So I watch the sunrise many mornings a week, and I do what's called my second cup of coffee several times a week, where I talk more in depth about issues going on around our nation. And so I welcome you to connect with me on social media. I'm Wireless Hogan most places. If you go to my website, wirelesshogan.com, you can get links to all of my social media accounts. But it's been an honor to be with you. So thank you so much. I am deeply humbled by this opportunity to speak with you today.
Great, great. Be well, everyone. Be safe. Until next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.